Teaching Writing. This was first presented by Annette Hendry with adaptations by Linda Probert to fit this audience. What's the writing process and what are the steps in the writing process? As we are teaching our young students to write, we need to think about these. The writing process is a way of looking at writing instruction that shifts the emphasis from the finished product to what writers think and do as they are writing. We want to really look at how do we write? What should we be thinking about as we're reading? What are the steps in the writing process? There are 5. Pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing, and finally publishing. Think about each of these before we go to the next slides and see if you could define what those might entail in the writing process. Pre-writing is the first one. We want students to choose a topic. It's easier for people to write about something they're very familiar with, things that they've experienced. That will help them stay engaged in the writing process. We want them to think about gathering and organizing their ideas. Often it's a good idea to have a writing folder where you have a sheet of paper in one pocket where they just write ideas about things they could write about when we come to writing workshop. We want them to consider the audience. Who would be reading this piece of writing? What's their purpose in this writing? Are they telling a story? Are they trying to teach somebody something? Are they giving the steps in a process? We want them to choose a genre. Often, college students spend only about 1/4 of their writing time planning, whereas business executives might devote 2/3 of their time pre-writing, thinking about what they're going to write about and making an outline or something like that, so that as you start that writing process, you don't have to be thinking so much about what you're going to add here. You can just be adding details to what you've already thought about. Drafting is the next stage. We call this first writing a rough draft. It's just getting ideas on paper. And this is what we want to focus on with our very young writers or writers who are struggling, just to get something on paper, because then we can work on it to make it even better. We want them to emphasize the content rather than mechanics at this point. We aren't worried about correct spelling. We aren't worried about grammar, punctuation, for example. Again, it's getting some ideas down. Beginning even in kindergarten, we want to work on stamina and volume in their writing, so that we work longer each day with our writing, starting with a very short amount of time. And as they build stamina to be able to write longer periods of time, then their volume typically increases as well. Next is the revising stage. This is the time that we add and subtract to the writing. We want to reread it. We want to think about, is this interesting? Could we make this more exciting? Could we add some extra details? Maybe there's some things we need to take out. Editing is the next step. This is when we're doing our proofreading to look for errors. Young writers or beginning writers are going to need help with this. It often isn't effective to have kindergartners or first graders trying to edit each other's writing. This is a good time for you to have individual conference with students. You want them to correct mechanical errors. We call that like the punctuation, again, the spelling, the grammar. To make writing mechanically correct and easier to read so that when people want to hear our writing, it's going to make more sense to them. This is where we insert conventional spelling, for instance, for that temporary or invented spelling that the students are using at the beginning. If we worry about this too early in the writing process, they often stop writing because they don't want to have to fix it. Next step is publishing. Publishing writing, we want to do an appropriate form. So what is the purpose again of that? We want to be able to share their finished writing with an appropriate audience. Who's going to read this piece or listen to it? Are they going to read it to the class? Are they going to share it with their parents or siblings? Are they going to send it to a pen pal? Are they going to produce a recording or a videotape? How are they going to share their writing? Some points to remember: that the writing process is not a linear process, it's recursive. We need to help students understand this, that authors, when they're writing a book or an article, whatever it is they're writing, they don't do it one time. They don't sit down and go through the process and they're finished. They go back several times. You can find information about children's writers and how sometimes they've spent hundreds of times that they go back and really pay attention to their sentences and the words that they've used. Sometimes it's easy to equate this to a baseball game, if students are familiar with that. To think about that if they look at a baseball diamond, that the pre-writing is the warm-up. What happens before they even start writing? First base, now they're getting a draft, they're getting some ideas done. Second base, they're starting to revise their work. Third base, they're editing to make it better. And finally, home base is publishing. We need to help them understand that runners don't always get to home base. Sometimes they go part way around and they stop. Or they start to run to another base and they have to go back. That often we need to play in little league games before we get to professional games. That they can understand that it is a process of learning to write and that we work on different pieces at different times. Now let's talk about the 6+1 traits. When we look at the standards, we know that we need to evaluate students' writing, not just have them writing. There are 6 traits that started out and then 1 was added. What are the 6+1 traits? Ideas, organization, word choice, voice, sentence fluency, conventions, and finally, presentation. On the following slides, you'll see several posters that you could print and put around your classroom, that as you're teaching these different parts of the writing process, the traits, are questions that they could ask themselves if they're finished writing. The first one is ideas. What is my message? Is my message clear? Did I try hard to make it interesting? Do I have enough information? We want them to really think about, again, their ideas, the crafting and the elaboration that brings strength to the idea. The ideas involve choosing a main idea, narrowing it down, and then adding some strong details for support. They work from general to specific, helping children notice what others might overlook. The next one is organization. How does my paper begin? Did I tell things in order? Does everything link to my message? How does my paper end? They need to think about it from beginning to end. If somebody was reading this for the first time, does it make sense the way it's written? Often reading it aloud helps them see if they started with a strong idea, gave some details, and ended with a strong conclusion. The next trait is voice. We want our writers to ask themselves, do I really like this paper? Does this writing sound like me? How do I want my readers to feel? My favorite part of this writing is we want them to feel confident. We want them to have the story to have good read aloud appeal. Should be full of energy, life, enthusiasm for the topic. It's sometimes difficult to define, but it's easy to recognize when you're reading a piece of writing. The next one is word choice. Have I used some words that I really love? Can my reader tell what my words mean? Have I used any new words? Did I try not to repeat words too many times? When we begin teaching writing to young children, we do use pattern sentences. For instance, they might say, I like cats. I like dogs, for instance, just to help them get that flow of getting ideas on paper. But eventually we want them to work on using lots of different types of words, not just the daily Tier 1 conversational words. We want them to think about those new words that make the reading more interesting and exciting. You can do activities with them where you make a word web, for instance. Just say that you're going to put the tired old words to bed and you want to think of some new words. So for instance, maybe you're going to work on the different words for the word mad. And you can make a poster of somebody that looks mad and then think, what are some words like angry, furious, annoyed, irate, teaching them those different vocabulary. Maybe for pretty, beautiful, attractive, good-looking, lovely, gorgeous, helping them just really to see other words that they could use. You can do this during the editing process where they've written first and now they go back and look at what could I put in here that would make this more interesting to my reader. Next is sentence fluency. Did I use sentences? Do my sentences begin in different ways instead of every sentence starting with the same word? Did I use some long and some short sentences? Does my paper sound smooth as I listen to it? This is where it's easy to advise them to read their story aloud or their writing aloud and listen to it to see how it sounds. Or they could have a peer read it to them as they listen to their own writing. And finally is conventions. Now we're ready to go back and make those changes that makes it correct grammar, correct punctuation, so that another person could read the paper. Here are some things they can ask. Did I leave spaces between the words? Did I use a title? Did I use periods or question marks? Did I use capital letters in the right places? Is it easy to read my spelling? Could another person read my paper? The mechanical correctness, that spelling, punctuation, grammar, etc., students usually check for conventions in the editing stage of the writing process. It's kind of like signposts. They help the reader enter familiar ground so they can concentrate on the information without being distracted. They help us understand. There isn't any point in correcting these conventions before the final draft is completed, or students give up on wanting to write if they have to keep going back to make these changes. Now let's talk a little bit about Writer's Workshop. You might have heard this in a school or a situation you've been in before. So I understand about the writing process. Now what is it? What is this Writer's Workshop? Writer's Workshop is an organizational structure that allows the writing process to happen in the classroom setting. It replicates the practices of professional writers as they take a piece of writing from conception to publication. The traits are the language of writing workshop. So you're working on these 6 traits. Ruth Cullum said, the 6 traits represent a language that empowers students and teachers to communicate about the qualities of their writing. Often in Writer's Workshop, you set aside a chunk of time, maybe 15 minutes to 30 minutes. Often you begin with a mini lesson. What are we focusing on today? Maybe you're working on voice. Maybe you're working on editing. It's a good time for you to model the writing with direct teaching. So you have some sentences there and some beginning writing, and then you work through and think aloud this process with the student. Then you give them some work time where they work independently on their own writing. This is important that you have teacher conferences with those individuals or with small groups. Just like in a lesson we might have guided practice, we have guided writing as well. Sometimes people do this during their guided reading groups on one of the days. That you work on that in small groups, especially with different levels of students, with what they really need to work on. And then finally, it's always good to have some sharing time. This reinforces and makes the teaching point again. Some components that you might have in a mini lesson include connection. How are you connecting to the writing? How are they connecting to the writing? Teaching, where you demonstrate. You explicitly tell them what you're learning and you show an example. You have some inquiry time where they can ask questions, you can ask them questions, and then guided practice where you're there to help them instead of just assigning something that they do later on their own. And then we want active engagement. We want everyone writing. Ruth Cullum said, and additionally, think of the traits not as a set of discrete lessons to be taught each day, but a way of thinking, shaping responses to writing, and talking about the process. The traits are the writing process at the revision and editing stages. They don't stand alone in the writer's world. They shouldn't be taught in isolation. They shouldn't be portioned out by grade level. So in other words, in kindergarten we teach this skill, and in first grade we teach this trait. No matter what the level of the child, they can work through these different levels of writing. What about the standards documents? If you look at the Common Core, we really want to focus most of our attention on formative assessment and then use that to drive our instruction. Where are my students? What are they doing well? What do we need to do for the next step? Summative assessment should be only a small portion of your time. When you're finally looking at how has their writing progressed, what grade am I going to give to them? That formative assessment is so important in helping them really progress in their writing abilities. The standards identify the end of the grade level of achievement for writing strategies and behaviors and the traits. They often highlight a key word or phrase for each bullet for those strategies and behaviors and the traits. Research shows that writers need time to write. Sometimes we rush children through. They need to have some choices. It's often a good idea to have a writing folder maybe for each child, and in one pocket maybe just ideas that they might want to write at some point, so that when they're getting to write a piece they can look at some of those and decide what to write about. They need feedback and response. They want to hear how they're doing. We want to encourage them to keep working. And they need to see models of fine writing. So reading a lot of books aloud that is good literature, different types, different genres, so they can hear what that sounds like. You modeling some of the different kinds of writing for them so that they can see good writing. Success in writing directly relates to the amount of writing and rewriting a person does. Lucy Calkins was a very beginning pioneer in teaching young children to write. We understand that the more you do something with direction, the better it can become.